So in that regard, I think a lot of people that meet me, they're like, this person doesn't deal with anxiety. This person doesn't deal with depression. I think we all have our own ways of dealing with things, and I mask things or hide things, and I think other folks do too. I think I don't want to, I talk to some people who are surprised, and I try to just be honest and be like, look, this was not like hey, I hid this from you intentionally. This was like, I was not ready to talk about these things when they occurred. I was not ready to talk about them until I wrote this book, until I released it.
Hey, everybody. Welcome to Sound Bombing. I created this show for people who want to experience a radical, life-changing journey through the sounds of my diverse guests. I hope that each sound you hear on this show will strengthen your faith, encourage your dreams, and challenge you to awaken the greatness within you.
Drop the bombs. Drop the bomb. We're gonna drop the bomb. Drop the bomb. We're gonna drop the bomb. Drop the bomb. We come to drop the bomb. Drop the bomb.
This is a journey into sound. A journey which along the way will bring to you new color, new dimension, new values, and a new experience.
LaMarr, Darnell Shields.
The human mind can solve almost any type of problem, and our creativity can push the boundaries of what's possible. But what happens when problem solving or creativity run wild in our minds? We are so good at identifying problems and imagining scenarios that sometimes it's hard to stop. So I have a question for you, bombers. Do you ever get into imaginary arguments with yourself in an attempt to find answers? Or do you lose sleep reliving an embarrassing moment over and over again? These are examples that may sound familiar to you if you get lost in your head quite often. Although there are psychological explanations for why you might be in your head, in la cabeza, such as the desires to avoid suffering or get closure, or being too much in your head is likely making your life worse. And what about anxiety? Can't talk about being in your head without talking about anxiety. And aren't we all a little anxious nowadays because of all the things that are taking place? Well, everyone feels anxious, so don't feel like that you're the only one. Occasional anxiety is a normal reaction to uncertainty about what's going to happen next, whether that's in the next few minutes, days, months, or maybe years. Well, mental health experts define anxiety as worry over a threat that's still in your future. Thinking about a conversation you dread, for example, could twist your stomach into knots days before it happens. Like, I had some anxiety today. I had to call the IRS, and who wants to call the IRS anyway? And who are the IRS people anyway? Well, your heart may race before an exam or a presentation. I know it happens with me all the time. My son asked me, he says, do you ever get nervous or anxious before going on stage? And even though I get a chance to speak on thousands of stages, radio interviews, and TV, yes, I do. You might lie awake at night worried about whether you'll catch COVID-19 at the grocery store, at the movie theater, at the bowling alley, at the party where you're turning up, at the baseball game or the football game. It's all so normal to want to get rid of those uncomfortable, pit in your stomach feelings as quickly as possible. But that approach can make you more anxious. That's why I invited my guest today's show. He's the author and owner of Get Out of Your Head, a brand and book series that seeks to help folks like me, like you, overcome anxiety and depression. By trade, he is a software developer. He combines his experiences in the tech world with previous mental health battles to draw parallels between computer systems and the human mind, and give readers practical strategies for evading their own psychological demons. He currently has 2 books on the market: Get Out of Your Head, a toolkit for living with and overcoming anxiety, and Get Out of Your Head, Volume 2, Navigating the Abyss of Depression His mission is to help as many sufferers as possible through not only those books, but also his blog. And I love his blog, and I got a chance to listen to his podcast. I would like to welcome my man, Brian Sachetta, to Soundbombing. Welcome to the show.
Thank you, Dr. LaMarr. That was an incredible intro. I don't know if I'll be able to live up to it, but I'm glad to be here.
Hey, man, I like to bring my people up who are doing some amazing things, and you are doing some amazing things, especially with all the stuff that's going on. Just yesterday, there was the anniversary of September 11th. I remember my daughter being born around that time, and my mom was in town from Chicago, and we didn't know what was going on. We have the COVID case. We have the Queen who just transitioned. We have people who are upset about the Queen because they're starting to realize that the Queen's family wasn't always that nice. And so we're starting to see those things. So people are dealing with anxiety, and they're always in their head. And this is a perfect time because we're about to go through some seasonal changes, which affects many people. Fall is my favorite time of the year, not just because of fashion, Brian. I love the fashion, but also because the trees start to change the colors. Now, I hate when the leaves fall off the trees, but I love the colors. So, Brian, welcome to Soundbombing. Before we get this party started, brother, let my listeners know where you are calling in from. And also, we like to do a wellness check, brother. Let us know how you are doing.
Yeah, I'm calling in from Boston, Massachusetts today. That's where I live. Sometimes I go to Florida for usually the winter time. So looking forward to that this year. You were talking about sort of almost like seasonal affective disorder and trying to make sure that as the seasons change, we are staying on top of our mental health. So that's one thing that I like to do for myself. And the second question, which just remind me real quickly, I think it was a mental health check, right?
Check in, brother.
Yeah, so I'm doing pretty well. I think, some of the things that we'll talk about on this podcast, like just sort of cultivating habits for yourself, right? And understanding the patterns that you run. It takes time to do that, right? As you get a little bit older. And I wouldn't really consider myself old, but I'm 32. And, my mental health journey has kind of been one that's been fast and compressed in the sense of like over the last 10 years, I've learned a lot for myself. I've chronicled those things in my books. And I really try to, not only talk the talk, but walk the walk, right? I try to figure out what those patterns are and then live in accordance with sort of avoiding some of the things that cause me psychological distress. So,
well, I'm excited, man, about this conversation. Now I have to do the Boston test. Okay, I want you to pronounce the word CAR.
Yeah, so it's funny. I actually don't have I don't have an accent. Somewhere along the lines, I did lose it. But if you wanted a joke or something that people would say when you go park the car, right?
The reason why I find that so funny is because I'm from Chicago, and I was on a train going to New York. I was speaking at Manhattan College, and there was a bunch of young men from Boston on the train, and they said car. And I was like, I thought we were the only people on the planet that said car in Chicago. We say car, we say pop, we don't say soda. And so I don't know how New England slid over to the Midwest or vice versa. But are you a Boston Red Sox fan?
Yeah, I've actually got some season tickets, and I try to make it to a bunch of games. But sometimes it's easier than others to sometimes the summers are pretty busy. So I've been to a couple this year, but I think hoping to get to one more before the season's out.
This party started, man. I'm so honored and grateful that you decided to hang out with me. I love your website. I love the blog.
Thank you.
I love the image. It's not messy. A lot of times stuff is all over the place, from place to place to place. I love the logo that's right behind you. So this is a very interesting time that we're faced with because, again, as I mentioned, September 11th, we celebrated that yesterday. There's a lot going on, from wars to issues around violence, issues around racial challenges, politics, but then also bring it home where people are just struggling with COVID. People, young people going back to school, and they're dealing with a lot of things. So I talk about the danger of a single story. It's one of my favorite TED Talks. I've given a TED Talk, and it's a great story about the stories that we tell ourselves. And I want to talk about that. But before I get into that, how does one know if they're experiencing anxiety? Because what I'm discovering with this young generation, younger than both of us, they go on the internet, they read something, and they say, I have anxiety, I have depression, and they're misdiagnosing themselves. Now, as a disclaimer, you are a tech guy. You do not have a degree in psychology or sociology, but you also have empirical research. And I respect that because, again, as a researcher, I think a lot of times our empirical data sometimes, quote unquote, trumps, no pun intended, trumps some of the research. But But I want to talk about that. Let's talk about, anxiety. How does one know that they're experiencing anxiety? And maybe we'll start with your own personal story. I think that's a great way to begin the conversation.
Yeah, definitely. I kind of want to feed off of what you just said in terms of like my background, right? I'm not a doctor, not a clinician, can't diagnose, can't treat. At the same time, I do think we can all level with one another, right? And kind of talk on a human level and say, even though, you and I wouldn't be able to do the diagnosis, I think just speaking to whether it's a friend or a loved one or even ourselves, somebody like that, it's like, so there's a concept of nervousness, right? It's like, okay, I had to go I had to go on stage and give a speech, and that was last week, and I got nervous for that sort of thing. But that was the only time that I got nervous in the last couple of months or a couple of years or something like that, right? I would say that is not really an anxiety disorder or like somebody suffering from anxiety. That is just like a one-off sort of situational thing. When we get into the realm of disorders or like personality, sort of like specific personalities, right, or traits, those we're looking at like sort of cyclical, repetitive behaviors, and also, in terms of anxiety itself, is like the question really boils down to, is the thing, the experience that you're having in your mind, whether it's nervousness or you use some other word to describe it, is it around a lot? Is it preventing you from living the life that you want to, right? So if, for example, somebody has a hard time getting on the bus each morning because they're afraid of stepping out of the house, like agoraphobia or something like that, that's where, right, it comes up again and again, and it prevents them from living the life that either they want to, or just a normal, healthy life where it's like, I need to be able to go do these things in order to show up to work, collect a paycheck and whatnot. So it really boils down to that, is like, how often does it repeat and present itself in our lives? And does it get in the way of us being able to do the things that we need to do? Now, obviously, it's like, it's sort of a sliding scale or a gradient kind of thing, where it's like, if we were deathly afraid of heights and somehow we landed a job as like, a stunt double, and we had to jump out of a plane every day to collect a paycheck, it's like, well, that just kind of makes sense, right? It's like, most people don't want to jump out of a plane every day. But again, it's kind of like when you look at like a normal or the average experience and then trying to go out and perform tasks associated with it, if what's going on in your mind is holding you back from doing that, then yeah, we're looking at something more along the lines of a disorder. And that's when we would definitely want to talk to a doctor.
So then how does a guy like you, who's a software developer, then decide he wants to go on a journey of talking about anxiety, talking about getting out of your head? What was going on in the computer company that you were working for? What was going on with you as a young man growing up in Boston that you felt the need to write about this, to create a podcast, but then also stand on stage to share a story? What is your story?
Yeah. So it's funny. It's, I said this when my second book came out. Somebody was like, what made you want to write a book on depression? Or like, why did you choose to write that book? And I'm like, dude, I did not choose that book. And I'm not trying to
choose us.
I'm not trying to sound like arrogant or anything like that. It's just like, when you have certain experiences in your life, especially like mental health, or if you lose somebody in a family, a family member in a tragedy or something like that, it's like, you see when people, they get called to these missions, right? It's like if somebody in your family, like, and I don't want to like strike too many chords here, but it's like, if you lost somebody at a young age to a specific disease, folks often then feel called to go do work in that field, right? Because it's so important to them. For me, and I'm again, not trying to like sound arrogant, not trying to compare myself to some of these other things that folks go and do. It was just like, for a period of 10 years, I dealt with borderline crippling anxiety and also a little bit of depression in there. And I think like when it consumes you, right? It was like, if I look back on my college experience, I'm like, I spent 90% of that time in my head being so anxious, like just ruminating and whatnot. And it was like, sure, you learn some lessons. I definitely made some progress there, but it's like, it continued to take a long time for me to make that progress. And when you finally make some of those breakthroughs, you're like, dude, like, I have to tell somebody about this. Yeah, sure. It's like, what the question then becomes, who do you tell? What do you do with that information? Like, sure, you could just tell your significant other, your therapist, your family, something like that. Not everybody is going to necessarily feel called to a certain level of action, right? But for me, it was just like, even though I'm a software developer and I've worked in the world and whatnot, I was like, if I look back on my experience of life from 18 to 28 or whatever it is, I'm like, the common core thread theme was mental health issues. And it's like, for me, that was just, it was so wrapped up in me that it was like, I gotta number one, I got to get this stuff out of me. And then number two, you start to see the trends where it's like other people are having serious trouble with these things. And I'm absolutely not casting any judgment on that. I'm more saying like, I see the world and this problem that exists in it. And I know how damn painful that can be to experience that stuff. And so I'm like, I see other folks who are going through these battles and being like, look, I'm not going to solve every single issue. Again, I'm not a doctor, so I can't even really get on that level. But if I can, open up from a humanistic standpoint, share some of my experiences and help people sort of condense their suffering timelines, like that is something that I really want to do. That's actually, one of my personal missions is just to, as you mentioned in the intro to the show, is just like me trying to help as many sufferers as I can. So that's sort of the, that's the super high level experience. Happy to share some of the, intricate details, some of the stories that are in the books or the blogs or anything like that. But yeah, really just like again, didn't choose me excuse me. I didn't choose the experience or the adventure. It kind of chose me. And because of that, it was like, I have to do something with the information that I have because I just want to help people.
Let's talk about connecting our bodies to our mind. What was some of the things that was happening in your body when you experienced anxiety? For someone who may not be familiar with this, because again, there's a direct connection with our body and our mind, or some people say our brain. What was actually happening to you?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I think the common ones, right, are like a racing heart, sweaty palms, upset stomach, inability to focus, almost like a sense as if like your vision is sort of constricted, like you can, almost tunnel vision sort of thing. So a lot of those things, I mean, a little bit of insomnia as well, right? If you're really rehearsing something in your mind, chewing it over all night, it's going to be hard to get to bed, especially when you're having these cold sweats in the middle of the night and tossing and turning and whatnot. So those are a lot of the common, I'd say common symptoms in general, but also the ones that I dealt with. I think that, I give a story at the beginning of my first book, which was basically, I was 18 years old. I had met this girl at college one of the first weeks, and, I kind of liked her. It seemed like she kind of liked me. And I had a panic attack about 6 months before that on a date with a different woman. And so that experience was like really wound up or kind of tied up in my physiology, right? And it's like something that I really couldn't get out of my own mind. It was just something that I focused on all the time. I was like, I got to try to avoid that, but I also don't know how to, right? So it was more just, again, you talked about like trying to solve problems and how sometimes that almost we almost do that to our own detriment where it's like we're trying to brute force through this thing, and 6 months later you're like, well, I still don't have a solution, but it's got to be there, right? I got to be right on the cusp of an answer. So I guess getting back to the story was basically I met this girl, she comes over, and I'm thinking to myself like, I am nervous because it's a Friday night. I haven't had anything to drink. Not that we necessarily need to drink anything, but it's college. And that's kind of the environment that you sometimes find yourself in. And also like, I knew that I had these nervous tendencies, and I knew that if I had a couple drinks, I wouldn't be as nervous. And I was texting this girl, and she was like, I could tell that based on her text messages, kind of like sloppy with the words or whatever. It's like, she's been drinking. I'm already nervous. Now I'm even more nervous because I don't know how she's going to act. Is she going to be like aggressive, forceful, whatever? Like, I just don't know how to handle this. Right. And so I'm like, all right, I get like 15 minutes to figure this thing out. And maybe 5 minutes later, she comes like running up the stairs, and she's like, Brian. And I'm like, oh my goodness, like I'm about to have another panic attack. And she sits down next to me. And as soon as she sits down, she's just like, oh my goodness, why are you shaking? Like, what is going on? And just like gets up, sprints down the hallway. It's like, never talk to me again, whatever. And I am just so humiliated, right? Going back to the symptoms, it was the racing heart. It was the inability to think straight, to sort of like form coherent sentences and whatnot. And I think when you deal with an experience like that, and again, I'm not trying to compare my experiences to others. I mean, that in the grand scheme of things, if that's the worst thing that's ever happened to me, that's amazing, honestly. But as an 18-year-old, where all you think you care about is women and dating and going to the gym and looking good and all that stuff, when something like that happens, that's a lot of pain that you have to endure, right? And so for me, it was kind of like waking up the next morning saying to myself like, okay, that's now 2 panic attacks with women I like in the last 6 months, and dating is really important to me. So I got to figure this thing out. And, I think I wish that I figured it out in a matter of days or weeks. The harsh reality is that it took years, and it's still, something that I don't know if struggle is the right word, but it's like, it's something that you kind of deal with, and you have to continue to, put in the work and make sure that you're staying out of your head and not giving into your anxious tendencies, right? Because our brains sort of trick us into these things. They're they're very well programmed through evolution and whatnot. And so, yeah, just getting those stories out and sharing them with other folks, and trying to give them a sense of feeling as though they can overcome some of these things, and leverage some of the strategies that I talk about to avoid anxiety and whatnot. So,
well, what I hear from you is that there's a running script of being too much in your head. It may sound like, what if I'm not good enough? Why is this happening to me? So if someone wants to stop replaying instead of the thoughts that you talked about of the young lady coming in, if they want to stop replaying some of those thoughts over and over again, what would they need to do right now?
yeah, I think we could talk about like the high level and the low level, right? So the high level is the stuff that you just alluded to, where it's like the beliefs of I'm not good enough. I don't know if I can do this, that sort of thing. I think that is harder to address, right? Because it's a little bit more abstract. It's hard for me to say like, hey, LaMarr, you are good enough, and just take that as truth and move on, right? I think in some ways it's like, there's a phrase that basically like, confidence comes from competence, or something like that, right? So it's like, if we have been through enough of these situations and we feel as though we've developed some skills for ourselves and we've made it through some of those situations, we will then build that sense of confidence and feel as though we can get through future ones as we go through them in the future. I think that's an important piece to being able to like sort of change that belief narrative. But obviously it's like, so for somebody listening who's like, I have to go on a date tomorrow, or I have to give a presentation, or go on a job interview, and I'm nervous right now, it's like, that's not really going to be helpful. So I think the low level stuff is sometimes the stuff I write about more, because somebody wants to know, how can I change this today? How can I show up to that interview and not necessarily be nervous? I talk about it throughout all my books and blogs and whatnot. So it's there's so many different jumping off points that we do have here. I think what I would probably like to focus on is the fact that, like, in my first book, I've got two parts, part one and part two of that book. The first part is going into the low level sort of thing, saying like, you are already anxious, you are already feeling fearful. How do you walk some of that back in the moment? The second part of the book is the higher level, like, how do you get into fewer anxiety provoking situations in the first place? So if we focus on that first part of the book, there is a framework in there that I spell out called the 10 steps to getting out of your head. They're just 10 simple steps that you can walk through in order to feel a little bit less fearful, either in advance of an anxiety provoking situation or in the middle of one.
What are those 10 steps, Brian?
Yeah. So, I mean, I can recite them for you if you want to.
I would love to know the 10 steps.
Cool. Yeah. So what I like to do sometimes is we can walk through them, and then maybe we'll dive into one or two after I recite them all. Cool. So step one is to breathe. Sounds very simple, but if we were to get into that, there's some science there that helps control our physiology and whatnot, which is kind of interesting. And as you alluded to, the mind and the body are very, very well connected. So number two is determine the true importance of what's making you anxious. This one is specific to the situation in front of you, right? It's like, if you're going on a job interview, being able to say to yourself, like, what is it about that job interview that's making me anxious? And can I say to myself, this job is something that I want specifically. I'm nervous about like getting laughed out of the room, and that's going to have some impact on my future. It'll prevent me from, going to getting future job interviews or something like that. So being able to look at those, dissect those, and then sort of like almost ground yourself a little bit. That's really important. Step three, evaluate the potential outcomes and reconnect to the one you want. That is really similar to the second step, but it's a little bit more of like, shifting your focus over to, okay, I'm going to this job interview. I've been thinking about the negative. Let me remind myself that I actually could get that job offer at the end of it, and try my best to focus on that to the degree that I can. And if I can't, that's okay. Let me drop it, right? Step four, shift your focus to something positive. Again, similar to the third step, but doesn't necessarily have to be something specific if we're not going to a job interview or something like that. Step five, recite a powerful mantra. We could get into some of the specific ones that I use if we wanted to. Step six, stop questioning yourself. Step seven, utilize an empowering way to feel good right now. Again, these will be kind of vague and high level until we jump into some of them, but just going through them to see which ones make the most sense. And then step eight, that's get back to the present moment. Step nine, remind yourself the worst part of anxiety is the waiting. Step 10, remember this too shall pass.
As you heard, listeners, Brian gave you 10 steps, 10 simple steps for mitigating in the moment anxiety. So I want to ask a question about some of the steps. So getting out of your head needs, what I'm hearing you say, it needs constant practice. So what questions can I start asking myself to get a better idea of how my mind might be overthinking some of the scenarios?
That's a good question because I usually approach it from almost a different standpoint.
Go
And I
ahead.
think,
Let's talk
not to
about
be,
your approach.
yeah, not to be a politician, but so like if you think about my brand and the name itself, right? So get out of your head. Going back to the intro that you had for the show, it's like we tend to be problem solvers, right? It's like something comes up in our lives and we're like, we are going to find an answer. We're going to turn over every stone, see what works for us, see what doesn't, and then just keep plowing forward until we figure out, how to get through this thing. I think one of the it's fascinating and also super frustrating things about mental health is we can't, for the most part, we can't necessarily apply that same sort of logic where it's like, we are going to, again, turn over every stone and try to find a solution. A lot of the
Brian,
times,
why do we do that, but we don't do it for ourselves? Like we do it like, Brian, if you and I are friends, I always say, be the friend that you needed. So if Brian is going through this, I feel like most people do a better job of turning every stone, looking for a solution for other people. But when it comes back to themselves to then try to do the same thing, we just we don't spend that type of brain power doing it for ourselves.
yeah, I mean, I think we're talking about the same thing in slightly different fashions, right? So it's like, what I mean by this is, again, using that sort of example of like going to a job interview. It's right. Turning over every stone means ruminating, means saying like, okay, I'm in the interview. I see the whiteboard. I'm answering questions. I'm not nervous, yada, yada, yada. It's almost as if we go to war with our anxiety. And the issue is that anxiety can't really be solved. It's sort of just an emotion, even though it's a really, physical one. And so what we often need to do is like basically shift our focus over to something that doesn't make us anxious and almost avoid the question altogether, which is, it's so frustrating and also fascinating and also puzzling at the same time. I always go back to job interviews because I have had some in the past where, 2-3 days in advance, I'm like, okay, I'm visualizing, I see myself in the interview, I'm doing awesome, I'm getting the job interview, but there's still something nagging in the back of my mind where I still feel that thing sort of like clawing away at me, not agony, but the angst or the anxiety, right? And I'm like, well, if I just keep thinking and I keep visualizing, I keep seeing myself in the interview, I will eventually get through this emotion. And I think it's like, I don't necessarily have the scientific explanation. Well, I mean, we could go down a different path in a minute, which I could get to. Other than the fact that I guess that's just not quite how anxiety works, right? It's like the scientific explanation is a little bit more along the lines of evolution. So if you think about the fight or flight nervous system, which is basically what activates when we are standing in front of a threat. Back, hundreds of thousands of years ago, when we were living in the wild and there was a hungry jaguar in front of us, that fight or flight nervous system was so helpful, life-saving, whatever, beneficial tag we want to put on it. That was what allowed us to run away from, a threat that's in front of us, or I guess in some scenarios, throw a rock at it, punch it, whatever it is, like to be able to survive. That worked a long time ago because it was like, we are standing in front of a threat that is real right now. One of the issues with anxiety is that and again, kind of going back to what you talked about in the intro to this show, is like the problem is that these threats exist in our minds off in the future. And so we're thinking in the same, like our fight or flight nervous systems activate, and we get to thinking in the same kinds of ways that we would if we were really facing, a hungry bear or a hungry lion. The problem is that thing doesn't actually exist. So no matter what we do to this threat, we can't really get rid of it. The only thing we can sort of do is turn our focus away from it. And that's what I mean by like, we turn over every stone, in the sense that like we get inside of our heads and we chew through all these scenarios thinking that we will eventually think our way through the problem in our minds. The issue is it all comes back to the thing that you said is the problem. We can't get rid of the problem because it exists 2 weeks from now, a month from now, whatever it may be. Right.
Yes. So you bring up a word I want to come back to. You talk about ruminating. So would you say that there's a fine line between introspective and constantly ruminating over and over again?
Yeah, most definitely. And I think this answer has a parallel to the one that we talked about at the beginning with like, are you nervous or are you an anxious person?
Yeah.
If you just sit down and you think about something for a few minutes and then you're like, you know what, there's no answer here, or I'm not going to figure this out, or maybe I did figure this out, you're able to drop it and then move on, right? Rumination is really like, it's not necessarily like a psychosis or a specific psychological disease, but it feels just like it. And it exhibits all the same sort of symptoms that we get, when we are actually anxious, when we are actually depressed or something like that. And again, those two diseases are different, but just giving you examples of different disorders that we might experience. So going back to the idea of the sliding scale, right? It's like if we're talking about anxiety on one side of the scale, maybe we're like, just nervous. And on the other side of the scale, we have an anxiety disorder. If we're answering this question, it's sort of like on one side of the scale, we think about something critically for 5 minutes. On the other side of the scale, we tend to chew things over forever, right? We are up late at night, in bed, thinking about ideas that don't serve us, again, kind of make us have these cold sweats in the middle of the night, lead to insomnia. And then this pattern continues time and time and time again. And so it's interesting because a lot of these things do come down to like gradients, if you will, right? Spectrums where it's not black and white and saying like, this person is nervous and this person has an anxiety disorder. It's like, in reality, we all kind of fit somewhere on that spectrum, and being able to figure out our own patterns allows us to then place ourselves on that. And then once we know where we are, like maybe we're not anxious people, and that's great. But if we are somewhere on that spectrum, then we need to figure out like, okay, based on where I am, what are my tendencies? What are the strategies that then play best into those tendencies and help me evade some of the things that I feel in my body and in my mind?
That's why I want to go back to, that's why I appreciate the 10 strategies that you gave. Because again, most time people would just give one strategy, just say a mantra, meditate, pray, write, all of those things. But I love that you shared 10 of those strategies, because as you said, we all are on a spectrum. Now, out of the 10 strategies that you actually gave, that you share with our listeners, which one of the ones that you think sort of stands out to you the most as you've gone down this road? Because again, just like you, just like me, like you, we tend to provide the pill for ourselves first. These are the things that work for us. These are the things that work for me. Quite often, a lot of times we sort of add other things that might work for other people. Like, no, these are the 10 things. Out of the 10 things that you shared, which one was the one that really just caught your attention the most?
Yeah, let me just clarify. So is this the one that like resonates the most, or the one that I use the most?
The one that you use the most.
Okay. So the one that I use the most, and it's funny, it's like I wrote these steps in 2017, so it's been 5 years. It really be step one, which is to breathe, but also combining it with like going for a walk or moving my body. So it's like walking down the hall, taking those deep breaths, but also making sure that I'm getting the movement. I don't want to sound like woo woo or new age or anything like that. But if you think about like the anxious energy that's in your body, if you're like lying on the couch or just sitting down, it's all getting trapped in there, right? Until you go and do something with it. So for me, it's like, as I'm breathing, like, and again, this is more metaphorical than anything else. As I'm breathing, I feel as though like I can get some of that anxiety moving, and I can almost get it, like I can almost breathe it out, right? And then the same thing for walking. If I go for a walk, it's like I'm kind of shaking my body out, moving my body around, and that's allowing that emotion to sort of flow through me, almost like a river. And then it's like, rather than damming that emotion up, I'm allowing it to pass through, and hopefully I can get through it a little bit quicker. The nice thing about the breathing is that when we get anxious, we tend to get in our heads. We tend to breathe really shallowly. And that sort of perpetuates what we're feeling, but it also is a way that like a signal to our bodies to rev up the fight or flight response. And so it's like, not only is it a characteristic of how like, I know what I'm trying to say. I just want to make sure that it's clear to listeners. It's like when we are in a fight or flight state, not only do we tend to breathe shallowly, but if we are not in that state and we go into a shallow breathing pattern, that is a way for us to also enter that state. So I think in both positions, or from both perspectives, it serves us to, stop and say like, okay, I'm recognizing that I'm breathing shallowly, like through my chest or something like that. And I'm starting to choose some things over in my mind. And I feel that thought train going a little bit. Why don't I get up? Why don't I breathe? Why don't I try to go for a walk and clear this out of my mind, clear this out of my body? And the science that I had alluded to when I was going through the steps, when I was saying like, yeah, breathing is, it's an obvious strategy. But the reason why it's important is like, so we've got the fight or flight nervous system. And so that's called the sympathetic nervous system. There is the sort of counterpart of that, which is the parasympathetic nervous system, which some folks sometimes call like the rest and digest or the feed and breed nervous system. And so how we activate that system is we begin to breathe. And not as soon, but like when we breathe out deeply, we signal to our bodies that like things are okay. And it can kind of feel as though we are safe again. And then once it feels as though we are safe, it'll begin to activate that parasympathetic nervous system, which will then slow down our heart rate, kind of turn down the cascade of stress hormones, cortisol, adrenaline, and things like that in our bodies. So sort of long-winded on that one, but that is why I like breathing a lot, as an anti-anxiety strategy. And also I just use it a lot. So I find it very helpful. I think
you're talking to a person who understands the power of the breath. In the beginning, when I started sound bombing, because a bomb, is a healing, we would also start out with the breath. And I'm starting to learn more and more about the power of the breath. Just a couple of weeks ago, I had a guest on, Carice, who's a myofunctional therapist, and I learned so much about that. Of course, understanding the word myo means muscle, and comes from the Greek, which means muscle or mouse, which is connected to anatomy. And so, listening to her, and then who gave me sort of the research behind this, but then also listening to you, also adds another caveat to what I've been sharing with my listeners for a long time. Is that breath work and breathing is so powerful. To my teachers that are out there, when I talk about how do you discipline a kid, and we're not talking about any type of abuse, but you discipline the kid while you're walking and talking. You're allowing them to move their body. I always say that anxiety and movement really can't take up the same space at the same time. A treadmill, running around, swimming. And this is something you don't have to go and get a membership for. You don't have to go to the YMCA or to go to to get a gym membership somewhere else. But these are some things you're doing. And for you to say your top one that resonates with you the most is the one that I say is like meditation and breath work is simple, but it's not easy. You have to sit there almost like you're training an animal or a dog, like you're going to sit here, you're going to do this, and eventually it becomes a part of who you are. So to hear you talk about breath work in all of my talks and all of my sessions, in the beginning, people wondering, well, you're here to talk about diversity, equity, and inclusion. You're to talk about discipline and school culture. Why are we starting out with the breath? Because everything begins and ends with the breath. When you're frustrated with the student, when you're frustrated with your partner, when you're frustrated with the things aren't going the way that they're going, just take a couple of breaths and then you'll start to see your body shift. But then you're also preparing your mind, because the mind is very powerful, but you also can do these brain hacks. Again, that feeling that you get as if everything is okay. Now, it may not be okay, but your brain is being connected to the feeling that you're actually throwing out at it. So it's great to hear that as you look at, I think about a David Letterman's top 10 list, and your first one was, breath work is really, really important. So I really, really appreciate that. I want to also jump into some of your blogs. I love your blogs. They aren't like long, 2 and 3, 4 and 5 pages, but it comes with a lot of meat on the bone. And I don't even eat any meat, so I'm just using that metaphor for those people that might get it. In one of your blogs, you talk about acceptance and commitment therapy. Can you explain to my listeners what it is and how has it influenced your work?
Yeah, so this was a recent blog post. Thank you for bringing it up. It was kind of a fun one to talk about. I guess, just high level, I like to bring some of the, because I'm not a doctor and I'm, not necessarily qualified to talk about certain things and say like, hey, every person should do X, Y, Z. I just go to the research and I say, hey, this is what other people are doing. If we read some of the research, we can kind of take it on for ourselves. We can utilize, sometimes people say like stand on the shoulders of giants, right? It's like, I'm not going to go out and do my own clinical research or like a clinical trial, but I'll read the findings of a trial that already occurred, utilize some of those strategies. So, in some of my other writings, I've talked about cognitive behavioral therapy. And so in this one, it was kind of like, I've almost gone on a little bit of a tour of talking about these different psychosocial forms of treatment. So why don't we talk about ACT? So ACT, acceptance and commitment therapy. It's sort of like, there are definitely specific like steps to it and strategies and whatnot, but the high level concept, if you look at the two specific words, right, it's like accept and commit. It's almost basically a new perspective to a lot of different things, but I would say psychological disorders in general. So if we're looking at the accept part, it's right. You think about the serenity prayer and say like, allow me to accept that which I cannot change. I'm probably paraphrasing that. But then the commitment part is understanding that even after I accept certain things about myself, certain things about my body, certain things about my personality, I have to commit to doing the work, right? I have to commit to rehearsing the 10 steps, trying to stay out of my head, trying to stay positive in general. And, I guess rehearse certain psychological behaviors that are going to help me get past some of the things that I'm dealing with. So that was the impetus behind that recent blog. Was there anything in there in particular that you liked that you wanted to talk about? Any questions, stuff like that?
There was so many blogs. You talk about memory pointers. Can you talk to my audience? What are memory pointers?
Yeah, this one was really interesting. As you alluded to, I am a computer scientist by trade. That's what I do for my full-time job. I love the mental health stuff, but it just does not pay the bills right now. So it's a nights and weekends sort of passion project thing. What I try to do, I think one, because it's like, I'm trying to add value, but I'm also trying to use my own experiences and speak from a place of authority, right? It's like, if I go out and say like, if I talk about all these things that I don't quite understand, if I'm not living in the psychological sphere all the time, it's going to be harder for me to relate to different concepts that come up in the medical community. It's going to be harder for me to make these connections that then may be helpful for my readers, for my listeners. So memory pointers, this one is technical. I will try my best to make sense of this, but it's a little challenging. So basically, like when you are using a computer, and so I guess one more disclaimer about this one is basically, so because I, am a full-time software developer, I try to bring my insights from the computer world into other parts of my life. What I'm basically trying to do is I'm not necessarily doing this all the time, but I'm on the job saying to myself, like, is there some sort of an overlap between what I'm dealing with at my job, writing some mobile application or something like that, or some writing a piece of code. Is there something similar to what I'm doing right now with how the mind operates?
Which there is, and because I want to sort of pause right there for a second, because even though you are this computer software developer, and then also a person who writes about mental health, depression, anxiety, and also in your head, there's been a conversation for years. Forbes magazine, I was reading an article about last month about, is the human brain a biological computer? So I can easily see the connection from what you're doing to what our brain is doing, because there's a debate. Is it a computer? Is it not a computer? Some people say it is, some people say it's not, but there's some direct connections with, what you're doing to the neurons that are moving and firing off in our bodies and in our brains.
Yeah,
I definitely
absolutely
see the connection.
For sure. And I think one of the interesting things is like, I think the metaphor plays no matter what, whether we answer the question and we say, yeah, it absolutely is a biological computer, or it's not. Like, it doesn't totally matter. I think the similarities are there that we can then extrapolate, some findings, some interesting perspectives for ourselves. So digging into this specific blog post that you talk about with the memory pointers, right? Again, it's going to be kind of technical, but I guess the overall idea is, how do I bring an insight on the mental health side to readers from sort of my day-to-day experiences on my job, right? And so if you're like, I guess I'll put it this way, right? It's like, if you are using your cell phone or you're using a laptop or something like that, let's say you're using your cell phone and you open up a mobile application and there is a picture on the screen. That picture is stored in the computer's memory somewhere. And so you would sort of think, right? And this was how I thought before I, took some of my classes, my CS classes in college, or even like still to this day, you're always finding out different things based on, the operating system of the device that you're working on, the the programming language, something like that. But for the most part, computers, whether that's a cell phone or an actual laptop, the way that they store things, like, on their memory in the hard drive, is based on these things called pointers. So those are basically just addresses of, like, what I say in the blog post is like, it's the address of a storage box. So if I see a photo on the screen, sure, that thing is in active memory, as in, like, it's on the screen, it's there, but it's also probably in the device somewhere. Like, we could point to it and say, like, there is a specific part of the hard drive in which this image lives. And so how computers access things that are on the hard drive, I'm being a little repetitive, I apologize, but the way that they access things on the hard drive, or they refer to them, is via addresses, right? So it would say, I know that right now, this picture that I'm seeing on the screen is in address box 25 on the hard drive. The issue with pointers is that they are, this sort of numbering system is that they are done by reference, which means we don't say, like, I know that the image is right there. They say that in storage box 25, I know the image, like, lives there. And so one of the issues is that as a programmer, I could have a different piece of my code go into the computer's memory and change things around and say, hey, in storage box 25, I now want you to put something else. And then when a different piece of my code goes and says, oh yeah, like, I know that the image is where I thought it was going to be, go get me storage box 25. All of a sudden it's like, oh man, the image is not there. It's something else, right? So it's not pointing at the image itself. It's pointing at the place at which we believe the image to be stored. And so that's the high level concept about memory pointers. And then how this relates to, how our brains work and anxiety and all that sort of stuff is, let's say we have, we're preparing for some event that's going to make us anxious. That could be, again, a first date, a job interview, a speech that we have to give. At first, there is some point in our brains, right? Let's call it a storage box. Let's call it a memory address, whatever term makes the most sense. But we sort of store that event in a specific storage box, right? We do it, again, sort of by reference, where we say, we expect that in storage box 32, I have put something related to the job interview in there. And I know that when I go back, I can see that job interview and all the details about it and whatever. When we get into a fight or flight state, or at the very least, when we start to get anxious, our brain is like, we are experiencing so much uncertainty, and our brains and our bodies are trying to find as much certainty as it can, that it's reaching out to all its reference points and saying, like, oh, I felt this way. And this all happened so quickly and so subconsciously. So our brains are saying to ourselves, like, I experienced the same kind of feeling last year, last week, last month. Oh, it was when I was going skydiving. It was when I went out with this other woman. It was when I had a panic attack on stage or something like that. And all those reference points sometimes get put into the same storage box in which we originally tried to store, and again, subconsciously, but tried to store the event that we are thinking about that's off, in the future, that job interview that's 1 or 2 weeks away. And so, it's like we're going about living our lives. And, we go do something else, we go for a run, or we go out with our friends or whatever. And then we come back to the event and we say, hey, now that job interview is 13 days away. Let me think about it. And our brains, which are like these crazy and sometimes deceptive devices, right? They have under the hood gone into storage box 32 and changed what's inside of it. And so now we are looking back at that job interview as if it is the actual interview. But we are actually pointing at different things inside of that storage box, whether it be, that panic attack that we had a year ago or something like that. And all of a sudden, the event that is actually on the horizon gets blended with some of these other feelings that we experienced in the past. Because again, it's, we're looking at what's in the box, not necessarily like the specific thing itself. And so our brains are pointing, to the same places, but referring to different events, different feelings, different objects. And then all of a sudden, we are still, like, I guess our conscious minds are still thinking about that event that is 1 or 2 weeks away. I think we called it the job interview, but it doesn't look like it did 10 minutes ago. It didn't look like it did an hour ago. And that's because all the reference points, all the things that our brains have stored in that storage box are now different. And so the scary thing about it is, like, we can transform either normal events or events that are only slightly, anxiety provoking into these all-encompassing ordeals, because we are actually pointing at things that happened in the past. And so what I like to say to folks is, like, if we know that this is how our brains work, if we know that our brains, for better or for worse, they try to trick us through this weird process, we can stop and say to ourselves, like, look, I know I feel horrible right now when I'm thinking about that job interview, but this is my brain tricking me. This isn't necessarily some indication that like I'm going to this job interview and I'm going to have a panic attack. It is my brain trying to find certainty, trying to make sense of what's about to happen based on its previous experiences, if that makes any sense.
No, you did a great job of explaining that. And I'm sure my listeners were able to grasp onto it as well. Brian, you wrote 2 books, Get Out of Your Head, a Toolkit for Living with and Overcoming Anxiety, and Get Out of Your Head, Volume 2, Navigating the Abyss of Depression. Why did you choose to write 2 books? Did you miss something in book number 1 that you were trying to make up in Volume 2, or that you just sort of ran out of time or space in 1? Explain to me why Volume 1 and Volume 2.
Yeah, so I think the most simple answer is just that anxiety and depression, even though they are related comorbid diseases, they're 2 totally different beasts, and I think it makes sense to separate them. I think the more complicated answer, or the answer that is more applicable to my own life, is I felt as though I had made a lot of progress, but struggled, but made a lot of progress with anxiety over the period during which I was developing the content for that book. And then I released that one, the first book, and then got hit with a wave of depression after that. And it was something that I hadn't dealt with in a long time, where I was just in the frame of mind to be like, well, number one, it was, again, not to make this the suffering Olympics or anything like that. But it was a very challenging experience for me. And I was in that mindset of being like, so number one, I'm going through a lot of pain here. And so it's significant enough that I feel as though I really need to, do the research, read a lot of different books, find a way through this thing for myself. But also because I had already started the brand, I was like, well, once I do get through it, I'm going to have a lot of content, and then we can release, write and release a second book. So that was the inspiration there. Again, kind of going back to that idea of, I didn't choose these books, they chose me. I would say especially for the second one, where I was kind of like, in some ways, I remember being just this, not arrogant, but like almost sort of like thinking that I knew it all at the age of 28 when I released my first book. And then like shortly thereafter dealing with depression for a while and being like, man, I was just so humbled in a way where it was like, I thought I had it figured out and I don't, and we're going back on this journey. And so that opened me back up and, kept the brand alive, kept the journey alive, and also just, I guess, really made me empathetic for, some of the struggles out there, because I had not been through something like that before on the depression side. So, I guess it just really connected me with all, the sufferers out there. That was a tough one.
Well, as a writer, I'm always interested in the process of other writers. You're writing a book that's so personal. Did you feel like that you would re-traumatizing yourself again? Because again, you are pulling up your own stuff and you're bearing your soul to a group of people that don't know you, and you're bearing your soul to a group of people who do know you, i.e. the woman that you said that you went out on a date with, family members, college roommates, college buddies. All of those people now are going to possibly look at you in a different way. What was the response of the releasing of the book from the people that knew you? And then did you feel like that you were taking yourself to the ringer all over again as you bared your soul on these pages?
Yeah, let me answer it one at a time, right? So what was the response from people who knew me? I think there was definitely a little bit of surprise with both books, where I would, my doctor would call me like a highly functioning anxious, a highly functioning depressed person, or in the past, right? Where it's like, I will talk to him and he'll be like, look, I mean, I could put you on this medication, but like, it seems like you're doing okay. Like you're struggling, but you're doing okay. Like, what do you think? And I'm kind of like, yeah, I kind of agree. So in that regard, I think a lot of people that meet me, they're like, this person doesn't deal with anxiety. This person doesn't deal with depression. I think we all have our own ways of dealing with things, and I mask things or hide things. And I think other folks do too. I think I don't want to, I talk to some people who are surprised, and I try to just be honest and be like, look, this was not like hey, I hid this from you intentionally. This was like, I was not ready to talk about these things when they occurred. I was not ready to talk about them until I wrote this book, until I released it. The people who were closest to me, like my friends, my family, most of them I sat down and was like, hey, this is what I am working on. But that was only like 6 people, right? And so
Any
it's
of
like,
them
I'm
connect the dots? Did any of it make sense to them? Was it like, as Oprah says, was it an aha moment from the people that knew you and it said, okay, now this makes sense because of dot, dot, dot?
I'm not sure. I mean, obviously, like, somebody like my mother who has been there through all of the struggle, she was like, yeah, this makes a ton of sense.
Okay.
But the kind of either the next circle out or the folks that I didn't talk with as much about this stuff, it was probably more surprising. But I just I tried to be honest. I tried to, just give, like, I can't sit 100 people down and tell them like, hey, this is what I have struggled with, this is why I'm working on what I'm working on. But I did try to get that out to the people who might be the most surprised, like, the people closest to me in my circles. So that was definitely important. There's folks in the books, right, that I reference that they might not know that they're, I've changed everybody's names in the books, but they might not know that they are referenced in the book. So I don't know what their reaction is. I think in a lot of ways, it's like, going into the second part of the question, which was like, was it difficult to dig this stuff back up and whatnot? I would say no. I think in a lot of ways, it's like, if I wasn't ready to talk about this stuff, I wouldn't have. And so in some ways, like, I'm not saying that, it's all easy or that, bringing back a certain memory doesn't come with a little bit of pain or something like that. But if I wasn't ready to talk about these things, I wouldn't have. So it wasn't a completely harrowing ordeal to write about these things. There was one other point that I wanted to bring up about that. I think kind of just the fact that, some of the folks that are in the book that may, or I guess both books that may or may not know about it, I don't know what their reaction is. And I guess I don't know. That's kind of the best I can do, right? It's like, I don't know if I have time to call every single person. And some of those people just aren't necessarily in my life anymore. But it's, if you read the books, none of it is to expose anybody, nobody, and it's not to talk down upon anyone. It's all in the name of trying to make sense of the experiences and then help people, right? And I think, a message that I bring to some of the podcasts is basically saying, like, if you are an author or you're starting a business or something like that, sure, if you start a business, like, you got to make money, right? Otherwise the business goes out of business. But if you are writing books and you're like, hey, I'm only doing it because I'm going to make millions of dollars. Mm-hmm. I hate to say it, but the percentage of people that get to that point is a very, very small percentage. I'm not saying that somebody who is listening couldn't get there, but it is hard. And for me, I look at it and I say, I am definitely not at that point. And if I didn't do it, if I didn't go on this journey, if I didn't write these books to help people, and it was only to make money, I would have stopped a long time ago. So it's really about the impact and some of the change that I can inspire in readers.
Well, I think you chose a great title because what I hear a lot, and I want to play this gender game, I hear it quite a bit. I hear that many women are constantly saying, I'm always in my head. I'm always in my head. Rarely do I hear men say that as much as the females that I've come in contact with. It's this whole concept of getting out of your head, creating this story, creating this narrative. And then not only do we create the story, we create this narrative, then we we put ourselves around other people who's going to continue to tell the story. As I referenced earlier, the TED Talk, The Danger of a Single Story. So you create this story and then you bring on all these other actors, producers, cameramen, grips, all these other folks to come and to then put on this performance. And you are basically navigating and helping shape a story that you eventually believe. And then all of a sudden, someone comes along and says, well, I didn't know I played a role in that. As you were talking, I'm thinking about A Beautiful Mind. Great book, great film. And I remember when the film was over, when it ended, there was nobody in this guy's room. He was in the room by himself. And what I loved about the writer, I love about the director and the actor, but they were able to take us in a world where mental health was real. These people were real. Now, do we know that they existed? We don't know. There may be some research and data support it. But what I love about it, it literally took us through. We thought that the women he was dating, the men he hung out with, the roommate, and then he ended up in a room by himself. And so I really love the title because I've said this to people, get out of your head. Get out of your head. Get out of your head. And it's getting them started. But what I've not been able to do, what I've gotten better is, and your book helps me with this, is giving them strategies on how to get out of their head. Because you can say to a person, Brian, get out of your head. Get out of your head. But what does that actually mean? When everything typically starts with a thought, and then we speak it into existence, or we write it into existence, and then we act on what we're actually thinking. And so I enjoyed, the title was amazing, and I think you did a great job. Great job.
Thank you. And it's, it is interesting. There are definitely days where I say to myself, I love the title. I love the brand. But is it too flippant, right? Is it a little too much to say to somebody like, just get out of your head, right? Does that come off as minimizing or downplaying or something like that? And then I think about it and I'm like, I don't know. I don't think so. I think it's more, the title captures your attention and you stay for those concrete strategies that I spell out. So it's, I don't know. That's sort of the way that I get people in the door.
You are a blogger, you have a podcast, you have merchandise on your website. How has all of this work, and you've written 2 books, how has all this work helped you, Brian, to then better navigate the world from someone who was constantly in his head, constantly dealing with anxiety? How has it helped you to navigate the world that you're in right now and all the things that you've been doing?
Yeah, I appreciate the question. It's a really good one. It's, sometimes it's fun to talk about yourself, right? I think 2 things. Number one is it gives me an excuse. And I mean that in the best way possible, where I look back on being 18 and I'm like, I don't want to tell anybody that I'm dealing with anxiety, that I'm dealing with depression, anything like that. I'm way too afraid to talk about it, whatever. Nowadays, it's like I go on a first date, which again, I still get nervous when I go on dates. I think a lot of people do. Nothing wrong with that. Obviously, it's like, going back to that sliding scale, you don't want to be on the far end of it where it's like, for weeks in advance, you're so far in your head, almost having a panic attack, like in your apartment. But nothing wrong with getting a little nervous before something that's important to us. So it's like, I might go on a date and the minute that the person asks me what I do, I might even just forget about software development for a little bit. I might just say, I write books in the mental health space. I have a book on anxiety. I have a book on depression. It gives me an excuse to just be like, this is what I deal with. I have so much I've spent so much time here that there's no reason for me to be embarrassed about this stuff, right? This is who I am. This is what I do, rather than there's no option to hide it because it's such a big part of my life, such a big part of my personality. So that's one thing that's been really great for me in that regard. I think the other thing, maybe I'll go into 3 things. So that's number 1. Number 2 is, it's like, I look at the books, I look at the blogs, like a little bit of teaching other people, a little bit of almost a journal too, right? Like making sense of my own experiences. And then when I distill those down and I come up with strategies for myself, if I take all those things over time and look back, I can say a lot of the things that, I write about them because they helped me. And by virtue of helping me, I can now say that I'm in a much better place than I was when I was 18 or something like that. So, the books, the brand, the blog, that has helped me with my own journey. I think the sort of third thing that I want to talk about is just being able to help other people. That's really, fulfilling for me, meaningful for me, getting messages from folks and being like, hey, I read your book, I read your blog, whatever. It helped me a lot. I'm leveraging this specific strategy right now, or I did last night or something like that. And it really helped me with my anxiety. It really helped me with my depression. That is one of those things that's it's hard to put that into words, right? Because it's I think, I'm not saying that every single person on earth is a good person, right? There are some people that aren't. But I think for the most part, we want to help other people. We want to lift people up. We want to inspire them and whatnot. And it's this is my way of doing that. When I get those messages and it's not an ego stroking thing. It's just I see the suffering in other people. And when I can alleviate that a little bit, it's just man, there's nothing better than that for me. So.
Well, speaking of helping other people, how can my listeners get in contact with you? And if they want to be a part of your coaching class, as well as pick up some of your amazing materials, your books and your blog?
Yeah, best places would be my website and then Instagram. So starting with the website, that's getoutofyourhead.com. It's all one word. There's no dashes. There's no spaces there. There's a contact form on there if you want to reach out to me. And then on Instagram right now, which is the social media platform that I'm currently most active on, and it's what is it? I think it's September of 2022 already. That handle there is get out of your head. There are no dashes, no spaces on that either. I always say, like, the Instagram account, like it doesn't necessarily have like my name on it. I mean, I do have my own account, but it's also not like me hiding behind some wall. Like, I am the one who's running that account. Sometimes I'll have other people post for me, if I'm busy or whatever. But like, if you send me a DM, like, I'll get back to you. That is such a big part of the author journey for me. It's like, I want to hear those stories. I want people to reach out and say, like, hey, I have a question, or I have a story, or here was my experience, or something like that. So please reach out if you want to. And then also just like in general, right? It's like, no matter what you want to reach out about, like, I'd love to hear about it. But also, if you are struggling with something and you want to speak to somebody about it, like, I'm not a doctor, so I might not necessarily be able to say, like, hey, I can do XYZ for you, but at the very least, we can get the conversation started. I might be able to, it's possible I could help you. I could also, if I'm not in that position, I could point you to somebody else. So please, if you do feel the need or the desire to reach out, please do.
If you had to give listeners just one takeaway for better dealing with depression, anxiety, what would it be?
Yeah, so I think the answers would be a little bit different for each disease. So let's go with anxiety first. Sticking sort of with the ethos and the conversation, it really is get out of your head. And it's so much easier said than done. But, I like to reference this Einstein quote. And he basically says, like, a problem cannot be solved with the same level of consciousness that created it. And I think about that a lot when it comes to anxiety, right? If we get into our heads through overthinking, then overthinking is not going to then get us back out of that problem, not going to help us alleviate that anxiety, right? So it's like we almost have to go in a different direction. That different direction is to get out of our heads, to use, some of those 10 steps that we talked about to just distract ourselves from what's going on in our mind. It's like, it is so frustrating at times to be like, no, like, my brain is telling me all these crazy things, and like, it's the universe is sending some special message to me. I need to, rehearse this thing in my mind. I need to think about what's going on because something bad might happen. It's like, sure, I'm not saying that could never happen, but you deal with anxiety, you deal with depression for long enough, you realize that your brain just sometimes plays tricks on you. And it's like, sometimes you just need to drop the rope and be like, look, I'm not dealing with you today. Like, I'm going for a walk. I'm doing something else. I'm getting out of my head. So that's a little long-winded answer on that one. On the depression side, we sort of covered it already, but there's a ton of studies out there that just show the effectiveness of like a regimented exercise plan in treating depression. So it's like, whether that is walking for an hour a day or going for a run, swimming, lifting weights, something like that, the important thing there is to be consistent, right? Get your heart rate elevated a little bit, but also just like have that as a consistent outlet. I can't tell everybody what the right plan is for them because it's all different. People come in different shapes and sizes and body types and stuff like that. But like, sort of just get out there and see what works for you, see what feels good. If you're in a position where you're like, all I can do is walk right now, start there, and then kind of build up gradually. For me, my own regimen is sort of like 5 days a week of relatively intense exercise. So that might be a couple days worth of weightlifting, couple runs. If it's pool season or something like that, I might go for a swim, kind of combine 5 days of those things, Monday through Friday. And then Saturday, Sunday, I'm just going for longer walks to keep the blood flowing and to clear my head when I need to. So I think that's, the science really backs that one. And it just feels good. Like getting up, using your body, feeling accomplished, like it's definitely a powerful strategy.
Now, I know you offer coaching classes and sessions for folks who want to be a part of the work that you're doing, who are dealing with some of the things that you've actually just discussed. What is it like being coached by Brian? What is it like being coached by Brian? Walk me through maybe one of your activities that you would actually take us through a session.
Yeah, sure. I'd say two things to think about. So the first one is like, my overall approach is tough love. It's like, I'm definitely not going to be like mean or anything like that, but I will tell you things that you probably need to hear that you may not have heard before, right? It's like, if you think about the name itself, get out of your head, right? That is a little aggressive, right? Being like, dude, like you got to put this stuff down. That's the same kind of approach I bring in the coaching. And obviously, like, if somebody's going through like it's it's a nuanced approach where it's like I have to be on the phone with the person and understand, like, through their tone of voice and whatnot, like what they are going through and where their headspace is at. I'm not going to, like, be overly harsh for no reason, or for somebody who's really, really struggling. So it is nuanced, but at the same time, it's like I don't sugarcoat things because I don't want to do that if it's not helpful. And I would say most of the time it isn't helpful. I think the second thing about the coaching, just about like how it's structured, right, or like the general perspective or approach that I have is like, because I'm not a doctor, right, we're not necessarily going to do the same things that you would in a psychiatrist's office. What we will do is we'll take like the content that I put forth in my books, and we'll try to apply those to your life. So it's like, leveraging the 10 steps, looking at your own patterns, trying to figure out like, okay, in what situations do I ruminate? In which situations do I get into my head? Where does my anxiety grow? Where do I find a little bit of relief? And then trying to extract those patterns and say, hey, this is what we need to focus on. This is what we need to do more of. This is what we need to do a little bit less of. And it's definitely like an art more than it is a science. But overall, right, it's like I can't necessarily write a book for every specific person. So it's like the books are a little more general. And then on the coaching, it's like, let's take that information and apply it specifically to your life and see, okay, which strategies work the best, and how can we create a quote unquote mental health toolkit that helps you alleviate or get out of some of your anxious states, your depressed states, something like that.
Well, Brian, I can talk to you forever, and I'm sure my listeners are taking copious notes and really paying attention, because we are definitely in some tough times. We cannot leave just yet. The second part of the show is called the Super Bomb question. They're very different from the first part. First part, I just ask you a variety of general questions, but this time I need you to respond as quickly as possible. So I know you may be dealing with some anxiety. Brother, I want you to take a couple of deep breaths, because I want you to respond as quickly as possible as I ask these questions. You ready? Take a quick breath.
All right.
Let's go, Brian. What's your favorite word?
Food.
What's your favorite quote?
I'm going to go with the Einstein one that I just said.
What's your superpower?
Working hard, being a good person.
What's your spirit animal?
Tiger.
What moves you to tears of joy?
Helping people get through difficult situations.
What moves you to tears of sorrow?
Losing people, seeing people struggle.
What is the book or books you've given most as a gift, and why?
Ooh, tough one. Quick answer. I would say something by Tony Robbins, probably like Awaken the Giant Within.
What advice are you glad you ignored?
This one, a little, like, not to have a personal vendetta. I'm again, full-time software developer. One of my first ever interviews, I had this interviewer. I don't know if he was just having a bad day, but I didn't have a lot of experience. I didn't have any internships, anything like that. And he's like, man, you did so bad, and like, you shouldn't go into this field. Like, why do you want to do this? And he was like, I really recommend that you don't. And I ignored that. So it's paid off for me. So, no hard feelings, but at the same time, I do not forget that one.
What advice would you give your younger self?
Be a little bit easier on yourself. Understand that there's probably going to be pain on the journey, but hopefully in the end, it all pays off.
What do you know for sure?
What do I know for sure? I know getting in your head is not a good thing, and I know that humans are powerful and wonderful creatures when we put our minds to the right tasks and in the right places.
Final question, Brian. If you were in the Mr. America talent competition, what would your talent be?
Wow. I don't know. I really don't. I mean, writing, right? Something.
Writing would be a good one. Well, listen, he's written 2 amazing books. Get Out of Your Head, a toolkit for living with and overcoming anxiety, and Get Out of Your Head, Volume 2, Navigating the Abyss of Depression. Brian, it's been a pleasure hanging out with you today. I learned so much from you, and also learned a lot from just reading your blogs and listening to some of your talks. So thank you for hanging out with me today. Thanks,
Dr. LaMarr. This was great. Definitely stimulating, challenging. I hope that we gave listeners a lot to chew on.
Well, thank you. And I cannot do this show without my amazing group, my amazing team, Supremacy for our theme music, and all of you for listening. Listen, make sure you subscribe, leave a comment, stop being stingy, share me with all of your friends. If you want to know more about me, you can visit Dr. DRL briandiaz.com. If you like this show, if you like this episode, which I'm sure you did, please subscribe. And as always, believe that something wonderful is about to happen and that some people miss the message because they're too busy looking for the mess, but not you because you've been listening to Sound Bombing. Go out and pick up his book. Brian, take care. Peace.